name is Maria Nodolf.
And my name is George Lowry.
We're here at the Orangevale History Museum. It is September 6th, 2023, and we are here to interview Robert Leever, whose parents contributed a lot to Orangevale history. And Bob is also going to talk about his experiences growing up in Orangevale. So Bob, let's start with your parents. Your father's name?
Roger, R-O-D-G-E-R.
And he, what year was he born?
1914.
And where was he born?
In Defiance, Ohio.
And your mother?
My mother was born in 1916 in, I have it written down here. Let's see. In Montana, near Helena. I think it was called Deerfield or something like that. But she had a rather interesting childhood. So.
What's her maiden name?
Chef, C-H-E-F-F. An interesting story about that one too. The original chef in this country was a Hessian in the Revolutionary War, and he was captured at whatever it was in New Jersey. What's that? Where they crossed the Delaware? Trenton, yeah, in Trenton, New Jersey, yeah. So he was a cook, and all he would say to the English speakers, he spoke French, and he was a cook who was impressed, drafted into the Hessian army, and taken to America against his will. And all he would say to the people who captured him, the Washington's army, was, "I'm the chef, I'm the chef." Of course, he was saying it in French, and so they wrote down that as his last name.
Marvelous, marvelous. Could you tell us a little bit about how your dad and mom got to California?
Yeah, I understand that they were both born a few years before the Great Depression, and they came of age. My dad was 15 when the Great Depression started. My mother was 13. They came of age during the Depression, and lived the first part of their more or less adult life under those circumstances. And when my dad was 18, I think, he told his mother and father that he and his buddy, whose name was Wiley, were going to go to see the Chicago's World's Fair. And when they got there, they actually went to the fair and toured it, but then they kept going. They didn't tell their parents that they were running away trying to find work. And they tried hitchhiking first, which did not work. Nobody would pick them up, and there just wasn't enough automobile traffic back in 1929 or what probably would have been about 1931 or 2 at the time. So they rode the rails. They were standing next to a railroad track, and the rail car was going by, and they saw people in the railroad car, so hey, and the people were waving them on, so they ran alongside and jumped into, threw the bag in and jumped into the railroad car. And they made it all the way, through the Midwest, all the way to Seattle, Washington. And on the way, my dad used to tell all sorts of interesting stories, and he said, it's really tough. You'd ride the rails for like 4 or 5 hours or 8 hours, and then the train would stop and you'd get off. And if you were smart, you got off before it stopped, because there was the railroad bulls that worked hard on the people riding on the rails. They weren't supposed to be doing this. It was getting a free ride all over the country, and hundreds of thousands of people were unemployed during that Depression. Young people, and wandering all over the country. So. They'd get off the train, and sometimes they'd find a really nice bull, as the railroad called them, the bulls, and he would say, "I'm supposed to arrest you kids, but look, the next time you catch the train, catch it before it starts slowing down here. Go back a little further and catch it earlier. Now get the hell out of here." And stuff like that was going on. He also told a story about being hungry. They didn't have any food. They had I think they had like a couple of peanut butter sandwiches when they left. But when they would get really hungry. They would go through a small town in the Midwest, stop and get off the train and go into town and go through the shops and ask the shopkeepers if they had anything that they could do where they could earn a bite to eat, something to eat on. And my dad tells this story about stopping in the grocery store one time. The guy had some bananas and stuff, and my dad asked him if he could have an overripe banana, and the guy said, sure. And then my dad said, do you have anything I can do to where I could get a good meal somewhere? And the guy said, yeah, I got some crates and the wood out back. It needs to be busted up for firewood, kindling wood. And you can go out and work for an hour or whatever, and I'll give you something to eat. And Dad said, okay. And he went out. And Dad was a very hard worker. And the shopkeeper came out looking for him. And he looked, and my dad had done almost half of the crates and the boxes and stuff like that he had. And the guy says, whoa, stop! Save some for the next guy. So that was kind of funny. But anyway, he got a good meal out of it and got back on the railroad cars.
And eventually made it to Sacramento, you said, because he heard that you could pick fruit there.
Well, yeah, they got to Spokane. They heard they could pick fruit in Wenatchee, Washington, and so they went there and picked fruit, apples mostly, which Wenatchee is famous for apparently. And they liked that work. It was easy, and they got paid fairly well. And the farmer at the end of the work gave them a free meal. Actually invited all of the pickers that he had hired into his farmhouse, and they had a free farm-cooked, home-cooked meal there. And when they got all done with the meal, which was delicious, the wife asked if they wanted dessert. And my dad spoke up, oh, I'd love dessert, and anything but apple pie. And of course, that's exactly what it was.
Right.
But it was apple pie, and he said it was delicious, and I felt so ashamed of myself for saying it. But anyway, that's the story he told. But when they went back to Spokane and Seattle to look for work in a bigger place, a bigger city, when the apple harvest was completed, they went back to Seattle, and there was very little work in Seattle. And I think they found a few odd jobs, but they finally found a bulletin board that said there was fruit picking available in Sacramento. So they rode the railroad down to Sacramento. Unfortunately, they picked a coal car, an empty coal car to ride in. And my dad got soaked, and especially going through the mountains. It was really cold, and he got pneumonia. Well, I guess they called it influenza at the time, and with pneumonia with the influenza. And he ended up in Sacramento in like a hospice where they, had cots for beds and stuff, and maybe 200 or 300 in a large warehouse type room. And doctors would come in every morning and look at the charts and the patients that the nurses were keeping, and all of this was volunteer kind of stuff. And my dad remembers the doctor looking at him and say, "Don't bother with him. He'll be dead by this afternoon." And my dad heard him, and he sat up and says, "I'm going to outlive you." Which he did, of course.
So did he end up picking fruit?
Yeah, but he had some shorthand skills. He had some secretarial skills. He knew how to type. And actually, he learned how to type because he took typing in high school, and he got through typing by repairing the typewriters as they broke. He never was a real good typist, but he did know how to type. But he was a very good repair mechanic kind of thing, and he just kind of instinctively understood mechanics. His father owned a auto parts store / junkyard, and I mean, when my dad was like 10 or 11 years old, he would say, "Roger, go out and get the starter off of that Studebaker," and Dad would go get it, and his father would sell it to the guy who was waiting, and his dad would whisper to him, "Bring this fan belt in too. I can get an extra $1 for that." But this was during the Great Depression, and my grandfather used to sell eggs. You know, they had chickens, so they had extra eggs, and he would sell eggs to the neighbors, just to, you know, to make ends meet kind of thing. Anyway, my dad could type, and he got a job as a secretary there at the center that was for the migrant workers. You know, they had the WPA actually gave the money to towns and cities and stuff to put the migrants up in fairly, you know, decent quarters and stuff. So my dad got a job there, and while he was working there, that was very temporary. It was only that lasted like maybe 2 or 3 months. He heard that there was work at the cannery in Sacramento, the Libby McNeil cannery, I think, in Sacramento. And so he went there and applied and managed to get in running the capping machine, which means you put, you know, 5,000 caps in a slot, and then when it gets too low, you put 5,000 more caps in the slot. A very boring job, but they're capping peaches and pears and stuff as they're going through the machinery, you know. And one of the advantages to the job was if a can got dented, they wouldn't sell it. They put it in a bin, and you could go over and pick through it. They didn't have any labels on them, so you had to kind of guess what they were. But you could take them home with you, and so that was one of the ways my mom and dad survived through through the Depression, managed to pay the rent and that kind of stuff.
How did your dad meet your mom?
Oh, that's interesting. My dad loved to roller skate, and he was very good at it. And he became the key boy, or the skate key boy, at the roller rink in North Sacramento. And so he would, you know, skate around and adjust your skates for you, you know, and make sure they were on your shoes tight, or if they were the clamp-on kinds, or if they were, you know, adequately oiled or whatever. So it was just what he did for the customers who came in. So naturally he got to grab all the girls by their ankle, you know, and tighten their skates, and they would giggle and stuff. And my dad saw my mom, and I guess it was like instant love at first sight, you know. So turns out my mother was a very good follower, and my dad taught her how to dance on skates. And they were very good. And when I was an infant, you know, like 3 or 4 years old, I would go with them to the skating rink. And they actually had a little tiny pair of skates for me to wear at the rink. And I remember that the skating rink was full of soldiers and sailors and airmen. So I grabbed a whole lot of khaki or navy blue pant legs as I fell. And I actually had one soldier whisper. I'd already tripped him up one time by grabbing his legs, and he managed to stay on his feet. And he said, he picked me up and he took me over to the railing, which is usually where I stayed, and you know, I made my way along the railing. And he said, "You see those 3 girls over there?" Yeah, and they had just passed us and were going around on the far side. He said, "Skate in front of them for me, will you?" And he knew I couldn't skate, and I would fall down in front of them and they would trip, which I did. And so he was right there, Johnny on the spot, to help pick up the girl that he was interested in. So, and that became my job after that, because I mean, he spread the word. See that little kid, he's willing to. So for a while I was tripping up young ladies so they could meet some soldier or sailor.
Wow.
So your parents were living in Sacramento. How did they end up in Orangevale?
Both of them, being children of the Depression, were very interested in being self-sufficient. And they were interested in buying farmland. They actually bought a lot in Carmichael, in a new development, a 1-acre lot that had 2 oak trees on it. They had to pay extra for the 2 oak trees. And they dug a well, and again, I'm maybe 5 or 6 years old at the time, dug a well and planted a garden, and actually harvested vegetables from that lot. Didn't have electricity on the lot, so there was a hand pump, and I even got to pump the water to water the garden with. I had to do 100 pumps. My mother had to do 500, and my dad had to do 1,000.
Oh my God.
So it was, you know, it only pumped about a quart of water per pump handles, and it takes a lot of water to make a garden, you know, to water a garden. And I don't know, I think the rows probably had 15 or 20 rows that were maybe 100 feet long. And a big garden, and they raised carrots and, well, not turnips, but peppers and tomatoes and squash and watermelon and cantaloupe, all of those things. And they would get very angry when they found someone stealing from it. But they would go out there, and when it was harvest time, they would harvest as much as they could, and kept the tomatoes, like tomatoes everywhere in California. They kept blooming and producing more tomatoes. So they would be going back to the garden and picking tomatoes in like November. We can do that here too. In fact, they planted a garden in Orangeville too.
Well, that's Carmichael. How
did they get to Orangeville?
How did they jump to Orangeville?
Well, they had already bought the lot and were paying money on it, and but it was a good development, and people were anxious to buy the lots, and move out there. This is right after World War II ended, and my dad came home all excited in the afternoon, which was very surprising. And he was dancing around with my mom yelling, and because he and his partner had spotted a farm in Orangeville on the end of Hickory Avenue, and they had talked to the farmer, and the farmer was trying to sell the farm. It was for sale, and they agreed to buy it. And they actually signed the papers with the real estate agent that afternoon. And so my dad came home and told my mom as soon as it was done. It was 40 acres, probably more than 40 acres. Well, I know it was more than 40 acres now, but we thought it was 40 acres. And so they divide. That's how they moved to Orangeville. It's kind of interesting is the next weekend, and this was in the fall, so it started to rain already. And it was a muddy road, and they drove down, they turned left on Hickory, from Oak Avenue, they turned left on Hickory going north, and all the way to the end of Hickory, and they kept looking for the farmhouse, which they knew was on the top of a hill on the right. And they couldn't find any hill with a farmhouse on it. So they got all the way to the end of Hickory, and they turned around and came back about a quarter mile, and my dad said, "That's the driveway, I'm sure of it." And they said, "Well, what happened to the farmhouse?" So they drove up the hill, got all the way up to the top of the hill, and there's people up there, and turns out one of them was a fire marshal, and the other couple were the sheriffs, and they wanted to know what the hell they were doing up there. What are you up here for? And my dad and his partner said, "Well, we bought the farmhouse. Where is it?" And they pointed to a big hole in the ground. It had burned down the night before. And the man who had sold the property to him and signed the papers and everything was Dad. So, but the deal went through. I mean, the man's relatives were perfectly accepting of the deal, so they managed to buy the land. The partner had more money than my dad, so he made the down payment on the farm, and he claimed that because of that, he got first choice of which half he wanted. So he picked the half with the hill, and which didn't leave a whole lot. There was another smaller hill to the north from the top of this hill, but as we're walking down the road to examine the rest of the land, there was a dirt road that kind of wound down behind the pigeon coop and over the far hill and then out of sight. And so we're walking down that road to see if there's another place that my parents might want to build. I heard my dad, or my mother whispering to my dad, "We're not going to build on the hill." And my dad said, "Why not?" "I don't want Milo looking down at us." So it was kind of funny. But anyway, we walked all the way down the road, and it made a bend and into a grove of oak trees, and it looked like a park because the farmer ran cattle down there, and they kept the grass short, and goats, and he actually had a fence spot on the alongside of the grove of trees that was straight, and he had strung barbed wire between the trees, and the trees grew around the barbed wire. So the barbed wire was embedded. It was a permanent fence that didn't need any maintenance because the posts were made out of oak trees. And so, but anyway, so that was and so it was like a little lot on this 40-acre parcel where he could run the cattle, and with the back fence and the east fence and the back fence on his property, which they did maintain. It was just barbed wire fence. But anyway, we got down around that bend, and there's a creek in the way. No bridge, just the creek. But it was Linda Creek is where it was, and beyond the creek, and no way across the creek, and the creek was maybe 2 foot deep at the time. And but my dad looked downstream, and there was a footbridge. And my mom and dad were, my dad weighed maybe 150 pounds, 160 pounds at the time. My mom was maybe 100 pounds, and I was, maybe 8 years old, and might have weighed 40 pounds, maybe soaking wet. But anyway, my dad and mom walked across the bridge and stuff, and Milo was standing on the other side. His wife walked across the bridge, and Milo was standing on the other side. And my dad's, "What's the matter?" "Won't hold me." What? Milo weighed about 300 pounds. And he started to cross the bridge, and sure enough, it didn't break, but it sunk into the water, and he got his feet wet. His shoes
wow.
wet. It was just 2x4s.
Sure.
And, a pair of 2x4s with boards across them. That's all it was, and a railing, a hand railing. But anyway, we walked up past that bridge, and there's another small hill to the north of Linda Creek, about 3 acres of ground. And again, it was beautiful. I remember this very distinctly as a child. It was like walking into like some of the pictures in my fairy tale books. It was just that pretty.
Sure.
And there was a few cattle down by the creek, and they didn't bother us or anything. But my dad said, "This is where we're going to build," and it was a great spot. So anyway, and we just improved the road, and we actually created for years we used the road going up past their house and made like a bypass around the house that they built on the hill, and then going down the original driveway. But eventually my dad made another driveway up over the secondary hill that went down to the far end of Oak Avenue.
So where did you live?
I mean Hickory.
Where did you live during this time?
Oh yeah, well. Since the farmhouse burned down, we were supposed to live in the farmhouse and build a new house, and that's what Milo was going to do too. And my dad, but they had both agreed that they didn't really want to live in the farmhouse. But Milo's wife didn't want to live in a shed. She was too fancy for that kind of thing. Her name was Mona, which I always thought was very appropriate, because she was always moaning about something. But anyway, she didn't want to live in a shed, and my mom and dad said, "Fine, we'll go first, and you guys can do whatever you want to after we build our house, and you can live here, or you can have your house built, or whatever you want to do, and we'll help, but we'll live in the shed." And there was a big long storage shed. It was probably maybe 100 feet long, and there was a shorter section inside. There was a wall inside with a door in it. And there was all sorts of stuff stored in the back of that shed that belonged to the farmer, and I found a complete set of the Oz books back in that shed and read every one of them in order.
Wow.
It was a really interesting kind of thing. So, but and gee, I wish I had them today. They're probably collector's items. They were the original books,
Yeah.
kind of, but they were on pulp paper. They probably wouldn't have lasted very long. But anyway, we lived in that shed. We lived in the first part of it. We moved a pot-bellied stove in there. We had a bunk bed. My mom and dad slept on the bottom, and I slept on the top. My job was to keep the kindling box full of kindling wood. So I'm like 7 years old, and I'm wielding a hatchet. It was a different time. It was just, nobody worried about you chopping your finger off. If you chopped your finger off, well, too bad, you should be more careful.
Right.
Kind of, that was the attitude of everybody, not just my parents, but almost everybody. Kids grew up a lot freer then and probably learned a lot more. But anyway, we lived there for 6 months while my dad built the house that we lived in for the next probably 15 or 20 years. Well, it would have been more like 15 years. And we always called it the little house. It was only 20 foot by 50 foot. Made out of adobe brick, which they bought in Carmichael somewhere. You know, Adobe's mud-dried brick, essentially what it is. Each brick was 4 inches tall and 8 inches wide and 16 inches long and weighed 37 pounds. How do I know that? Because I lifted a lot of them. But anyway, I still remember running down there one time. My mother had bought me some big old clodhopper boots, of which I was only supposed to wear on the farm, on the ranch, what they later came to call the ranch. And but I remember coming home from school and putting on those clodhopper boots, and from the shed, and then flying down, running down, and it just because they were so heavy. You know, and they were just pulling me forward, kind of thing, down the hill. They kind of slowed me down going up the hill, but fast going down the hill, and just enjoying the whole thing, and running down there. And the men, some of my dad's friends, and my dad were digging the foundation to the little house. And my uncle, he was my uncle then, seated me on top of the pile of dirt that they were throwing. They were, big trench, big deep trench, and they were throwing the dirt to the side, and so there was this big pile of dirt, and I was sitting on top of the pile of the dirt, playing in the dirt. I was still 8 years old, 7 years old maybe, and my uncle, who was always a practical joker, threw one of those Jerusalem crickets. He found it. He was digging, and they're, I don't know if you've ever seen one, but they're big black and brown bugs, about 2 inches long. And he threw it up in my lap with a shovel full of dirt. And I'm standing there looking at it, and I looked at my uncle and said, "Doesn't scare me." He was mad.
Good for you.
And I picked it up and threw it back in the trench, I find out later that they can bite pretty badly, but I didn't know that at the time. But I still wouldn't have been scared, so I just, anyway, those are some of the earliest memories I have of and there was a lot of cooperation between families and friends back then. My dad had a lot of help building the little house that we lived in. Later on it became our garage, but after we moved into the little house, and Milo and his wife started building their house, and they built it, but they would come out on the weekends and during the week and work on it. My dad would go up and help. But my dad was, by that time, had already designed and was starting to build. Well, I was actually probably not starting to build, because one of my jobs when I would come home from school was to continue digging the foundation, which had been all mapped out with string and stuff, and stakes. And the foundation was, it was 3 foot wide. Because my dad intended to build double-walled outside walls of adobe bricks, and they're 8 foot thick, 8 inches thick, so probably 2 foot wide. But anyway, he laid 2 bricks and with like a 4-inch gap between them, because he thought that would give better insulation and save on heating and cooling costs, which it did. But anyway, my job when I came home from school again was to dig wheelbarrows full of dirt on the foundation, which was in hardpan. When you got down a foot and a half, it was nothing but hardpan. So my other job was to fill it full of water in the morning as I went to school, and then dig the mush out, and then use the pickaxe to dig maybe another couple inches deeper. But I dug a lot of that, and my dad would come home and work on it too. But I dug a lot of it myself. So anyway. What was your question? You've forgotten your question?
I have. So your dad worked in Sacramento,
Yeah.
but you were living in Orangeville.
Yeah, and he had taken answered an ad in a magazine, probably Popular Mechanics or Popular Science, for being a refrigeration mechanic. And he applied for it. He had to pay money for it, and he applied for it. And he was so anxious about it that he would finish the lesson as soon as he got it in the mail and mail it back on the same day.
Wow.
And he did absolutely perfect on all of the quizzes and stuff that they sent him. And the thing was, it was like a 28-week course or something. And when you finished the course, they were supposed to take you and give you a tour and hands-on experience at the factory in, I think, Detroit, Michigan. I'm not sure which company it was now, but it was one of the major refrigeration companies at the time. Carrier, I think. But anyway, because my dad always loved Carrier air conditioning. But anyway, he did so well in the courses that he took the evidence of his scores in his test scores and stuff, because they'd mail them back after they corrected them. Took his test scores and walked them around and told people, look, I know about refrigeration. And he got a job at J.N. Blair and Company in Sacramento. And he actually got a truck to drive. It was a Dodge, and it was red, it had a red body and black fenders. It was an old Dodge truck, and it had sideboards on it that had little drawers in them, little bins that you could carry the refrigeration parts in, and on the inside. And then the big red signs, red and white signs, J.N. Blair and Company, refrigeration, on that truck. And I remember laying down on the floorboards to nap when my mom and dad would drive up to Dunsmuir, where my sister and my uncle, my aunt and my uncle lived, and to visit their kids, that kind of thing.
Sure.
So anyway, that was how he got his job, was just answering. He never did get the tour of the factory. But what's really interesting is years later, the factory begged him to come to the factory and give them field reports. Literally, I mean, they flew him there and back to give, and he spent like a week in the Carrier factory telling them what was wrong with their equipment in the field. How if you did this a little differently, it would be much easier to service, kind of said. And they paid him for that, So actually, AT&T at the time had those microwave stations in the mountains, in the hills, and they have to be air conditioned because they have a lot of electronic equipment in them. So my dad would do the air conditioning. And some of them were very fancy. They would have dual systems in case one side broke or something. And one time they had one of these places, up in the foothills, and they finally sent for my dad because their engineers couldn't figure out why this thing wasn't working. One of them was running very, very hot, and they couldn't figure out why, and the other one wouldn't run at all. And they didn't know that either. So they shut everything off and sent for my dad. And my dad come in and says, turn it on. And they turned it on, and after about 10 seconds, my dad says, turn it off. And they turned it off, and he says, that one's got a broken valve, and this one is connected wrong. You've got the output going back into the input, and of course it's going to run hot. And the engineers argued with him. And he said, look, turn it back on, and he started closing that one valve. And they were yelling at him, don't do that, it'll explode. And he closed the valve finally, and it started running smoothly and perfectly. And he said, told you.
Wow.
AT&T would actually hire him after he retired to go down and troubleshoot air conditioning equipment in their offices and their buildings and stuff all over California. They called him the best refrigeration mechanic in California. So anyway, that was my dad.
And I know that he and your mother were both incredibly involved in Orangevale, I guess you call it civic life, starting with being members of the PTA for Orangevale Elementary.
Yeah, right. My mom and dad went to the school and complained that the curriculum wasn't sufficiently rigorous enough for their taste. They wanted more math taught and more history and better literature, and they stuck their oar in when they decided it was, that they were right. And so they were, and of course the people at school said, well, you should go to the PTA meeting and tell them. So, okay, we'll go to the PTA meeting, and they kept sticking their oar in, and eventually my mother became the president of the Orangevale PTA, the Orangevale School PTA. And started making curriculum changes from the PTA, but of course, and eventually my dad would rise, and my mother was a stickler for detail. She actually became a parliamentarian later on in life. So, but anyway, my dad kept sticking his oar in his opinion at the PTA meeting. And so they said, why don't you run for president? You know, you're so smart, why don't you run for president? And so he said, okay. And my wife tells me I'm wrong on this, but I think he was either the first or one of the first male PTA presidents in the United States. Now, I'm pretty sure he was at least one of the first, and he may have been the first. But being in the PTA and even being running it still wasn't good enough. So he asked to join the board, and he board of directors for the school, and eventually he became the president of the board of the directors, and along with Dr. Manning and Dr. Coleman, I guess it was too. There was a Coleman involved, and so I think his name is still on the plaque at the front of the Orangevale School. I know it's become private since then, so I'm not sure the plaque's still there. But if the plaque's still there, his name's on it.
I'll have to go look.
Yeah, I agree.
Definitely. So he was president of the school board, but he did things other than school-related things.
Oh yeah, he was a joiner. He joined the Lions because he wanted he liked their they had charities and stuff that they supported, and he liked the charities they supported. And again, sticking your oar in, and my mother became a tail twister, which is the female side of the Lions, And but he eventually he became the president of the Lions, and it was a one-year office, and they kept re-electing him. He did that kind of a job. And my mother was not only involved in the PTA, but she would volunteer for voting. She would volunteer to man the Orangevale precinct. And I can still remember her telling me that she was so proud to sit at the registration desk when you came in, and they would look your name up in the register, and they would hand you your ballot, and that kind of stuff. And then she would announce, so-and-so is now voting in a loud voice. And she was very happy to do that. Because, and the reason they did that was so-and-so could have been a felon, and somebody there might have known that and say, wait a minute, he can't vote, or she can't vote, kind of thing. So it was actually a law that you had to announce the person voting, at least in California. I don't know the rest of the United States, because every state's a little different. But anyway, she would announce that kind of stuff, and she volunteered for that. And because the women's club was involved in voting and pushing, registering people to vote and stuff like that.
So that would be the Orangevale Women's Club.
Yeah, the Orangevale Women's Club. She joined that. And once again, nobody would run for secretary because it's such a hard job. But my mother would volunteer for it and be elected for it. And she did such a great job at being the secretary of the Orangevale Women's Club that they elected her to president. I think she was vice president and then she did such a good job at that, they kept trying to re-elect her. But it's a one-year office, and you're supposed to trade off, so other people get the that's where she became interested in parliamentary law. And anyway, she they would go to the regional women's clubs, and go, they would have seminars or stuff at the regional office, and she would put her oar in there, and pretty soon she was head of the regional women's club, and putting her oar in at the conventions that they would hold in LA, she ended up being the president of California Women's Club.
So your mom, two of the women that I've interviewed said that, mentioned that they always wanted to be like Carol Leever. Why do you think that is?
It's kind of hard from my point of view. I mean, I was a teenage boy, so I've thought about that question you asked me earlier, and the conclusion that I've come to is that my mom and dad were. My mom was very trim. She's always athletic. She had a good figure. She was very attractive, and would take her glasses off when she talked to people, that kind of thing. And not, but anyway, that was probably part of it. But the other thing that I was thinking of was that my dad and mom loved to dance. In fact, as my dad actually built a patio at our house, at the big house, and did a real terrific job on smoothing off the concrete, troweling down the concrete until it was as smooth as glass. And then they would put dust on it, and they would hold dance parties where they would invite maybe a dozen couples to spend the evening with dancing and drinking and, you know, refreshments, food and that kind of stuff, and dancing, but mostly dancing. My mom and dad both loved to dance. I mean, they were excellent roller skaters and they could dance roller skating, but they just loved to dance. And they started taking lessons at what was it, the Aerojet General crossed over in Rancho Cordova. They heard that they were offering free dance lessons to anybody who wanted to come and take them. So they went to those dance lessons and learned a bunch of new steps like the cha-cha and the whatever, you know, they just did a whole bunch, you know, the rumba and the, what's the other one called, they're all South American dances, and they learned how to jitterbug and do the swing and that kind of stuff. And they were really good at it. You know, they would show off on the dance floor and people would gather around to watch them. So especially when they were jitterbugging. And but anyway, someone said, you should give lessons. And they said, well, who would we give lessons to? You guys can all dance. You know, who would we give lessons to? And somebody suggested, well, why don't you give it to the sophomores, juniors, and seniors at San Juan High School, which is where I was going at the time. I think I was a freshman. And my mom thought that was a good idea. My dad didn't object particularly. And so every Wednesday, they would offer free dance lessons to anybody who would bring a partner with them to the dance. And it was held at the old Orangevale, what's it called? The Orangevale?
Youth Center?
No, not there. The old Grange Hall that burnt down. I even know who'd burned it down, but that's probably still a secret.
No, it's not.
Dickie, what was his name? Dickie Barker? Dickie? Something like
Baker.
Baker, yeah, Baker, that's what it was, yeah.
Was this on the same side on Walnut?
It was on Greenback Lane. It was right across from Pop's Bar.
He's talking about the community house.
It was called the Grange Center. The Grange, the Orangevale Grange.
Right.
And it was right on Greenback Lane, on the same corner that Cable Center is on now.
Oh, okay.
And it was a big wood building with a big hallway inside for meetings of all the farmers that lived here in Orangevale. And Dickie Baker, that's right, thank you for reminding me of his last name. Dickie burned it down. He was a pyromaniac. He burned down Roberts Elementary School too. I got to go to Roberts Elementary School for 1 year, and then he burned it down.
Okay. Yeah.
And then I transferred to Orangevale Elementary School, which is where I matriculated. Since my dad was the president of the board of directors of the school, he handed me my diploma, which I thought was kind of cool.
Okay.
So they held dances there, and but your parents did so much more. Your dad was called Mr. Penny.
Yeah, I was going to finish about my mom.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I think that might have been because she was such a terrific dancer and she had a good-looking husband.
Mm-hmm.
I think that might have been one of the reasons why the young girls thought, I want to be just like that. You know, I want to be a terrific dancer, and I want to look, you know, have my skirts spin out when I do the jitterbug and that kind of stuff. And I think it might have been that kind of adulation. You know, she was very pretty, and she always dressed well. And, you know, well, she was actually an Avon lady for a while. So she sold a lot of Avon, and then she kept her membership in the Avon. So she'd buy everybody Christmas presents from Avon for Christmas and stuff. I got a lot of aftershave.
Okay, Mr. Penny.
Yeah, he was, well, they were getting involved in the seniors here in Orangevale. There were a lot of elderly people here in Orangevale, and my dad was finding out that they frequently didn't even get a hot meal during the day because they no longer cooked for themselves. They were living alone, you know, their spouse had died or something and their children had moved away. And there were quite a few seniors here. And so they decided that they would start Save Our Seniors here in Orangevale. and my dad would collect money from the businesses. Just throw your change in here for the Save Our Seniors project, kind of thing. Something like what you guys are doing here for the history project. And but anyway, my dad would put the pennies aside into a 5-gallon water jug in one of those big plastic water. I mean, they're this big around, and they're about that tall. Even if when they're full of water, they're difficult for a young man to lift and put into the water cooler kind of thing. But he'd fill it full of pennies, and they'd need like a forklift to get it off the truck. But he'd then bring the pennies to Bank of America there in Orangevale, and he would have them sort all the change and put it in rollers and stuff, and then they would deposit that in the Save Our Seniors account. But he realized that was really hard on the tellers, because I mean they would. How would you like to sort 5 gallons worth of pennies? I mean, that's worth probably close to $500. I mean, that's how many pennies there is in there. So my mom and dad raised flowers as well as having a big garden, and so he would bring in bouquets to the tellers. Every time he'd go in the bank, he would bring a bouquet of flowers with him, of flags or gardenias or something that was really nice. They also had one time he bought in a big bouquet of a plant that grew right along our road, and I think they were called snowdrops. They're little white things. They look sort of like buttercups, but they're a little different. But when he came back, he had forgotten something. He went back in the bank, and that particular bouquet was outside. It has a very peculiar odor.
Oh, okay.
Sort of like those trees that they plant. Those what are they called? Fruitless mulberries or fruitless cherry trees, I think they are. Mm-hmm. And they have them all over American River. And if you go there in the springtime and you park under them, it has a very pervasive odor that's not particularly nice. So anyway, you were asking me.
He worked for Serve Our Seniors.
Yeah, and
Sounds like he started it.
Well, they found I think they used the Orangevale Youth Center, which my dad also helped build, and they were very active in the youth center area. The fact is, they were also very active in the powwow days.
Yeah.
So, and they kind of got, were tail twisters on getting that going. We need a carnival, and in a place where we can set up booths and the merchants can display their wares and stuff. And so that piece of land over there where the old center used to be, up on, that was on Hazel Avenue too, I think, but it was further out, further south. And but the community purchased that land, and they built a cement block clubhouse on it. It wasn't very large, but it was large enough to hold 40, 50 Boy Scouts, because that's where I joined the Boy Scouts, was in that center there. And the worst part about that was that the meetings lasted until 9 o'clock at night, and I got to walk home in the dark by a pair of Doberman pinchers that lived behind a fence. And I would walk all on the far side of the road of Hickory at the time. I think it was 2-lane at the time. And walk very quietly, but never quietly enough. And the dogs would come running up after me at the fence. They would get to the fence and bark at me. They were terrifying. I'm still a little leery of Dobermans, but I'm a dog lover mostly. Anyway, they were instrumental in powwow days, because my mother wanted to set up a booth for the women's club, and which she did. And my dad would set up a booth for the Lions Club, and they would man those things to try and get new members and that kind of stuff, to tell people what they did. And most of the merchants here in Orangevale would set up booths and sell stuff and that kind of thing. So that was how powwow days got started. And I know for a fact that my mom and dad were very active in that. So, and then you were saying about Save Our Seniors was, I think they used the kitchen in that clubhouse for a while. I think there was a kitchen on one side of that clubhouse. Not positive of that, but they needed a commercial kitchen to cook meals. And eventually they had some other place that they used for cooking meals, and my dad would volunteer and drive the meals around. He had a route to where he would show up at somebody's house and hand them a hot meal for their dinner that night or something. And I know that they charged 50 cents per meal, which got them in trouble. Someone eventually turned them in because they were a charitable organization and they were charging people money. And someone, I suppose, was worried that they were making money on the 50 cents a plate meal. And even back then, they weren't, but someone turned them in and they had to become a 501c organization and they could no longer charge any money. So they had to depend for they had to get more donations to continue cooking meals for seniors. And they needed a place for Save Our Seniors. And the cure, I guess it was what was it called, a Victorian house, came on the market for sale. And I think Save Our Seniors had already been given a lot over on Oak Avenue by, what would it be, Oak and Hazel, or no, Oak and something else, Walnut or something.
It's Oak and Granite, I think.
Granite, yeah, it's way down there, it's way to the east. So I think it's actually a block up from Granite, Filbert maybe, something like that. But anyway, they had already been donated a lot for Save Our Seniors, but the house that was for sale was in pretty sad repair, as I understand it, and so they bought that and moved it.
So they moved the villa. It was on Greenback, correct?
Yeah.
And it got moved to Oak.
Yeah, it was, and that was a big deal. I mean, it took, they actually hired a moving company and that kind of thing, and moved the mansion and then refurbished it, where it was. And I'm sure my dad did a lot of the work too. Even then, he was still very active after he'd retired from refrigeration. So, anyway, he had, I remember him out there at the center on Oak. My mom and I wanted to ask him a question. I was married and had children by that time, but living over in Fair Oaks, and I needed to ask my dad a question, and I went over to the ranch where my parents still lived, and I said, "Where's Stan?" And I expected him to be out working somewhere on the property, and she said, "Oh, he's over at Save Our Seniors." I said, "Oh, okay, I'll go over and talk to him there." So I drove over to Save Our Seniors. My dad's out there in the rose garden, in his overalls, in July, hoeing the weeds out of the roses, because nobody else would do it. Mm. And he's wearing overalls. He always wore a set of blue overalls when he was working. He'd put on a suit and tie when he went into the bank. But he always wore blue overalls when he was working, and he was soaking wet from sweating. And I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, someone's got to do this." I said, "Yeah, what about those guys on the porch?" He said, "Oh, those poor old suckers." He's calling people 20 years younger than he is old, because they won't get up and weed the rose garden in the morning, when it's cool. So anyway, that was my dad. So what was the question you asked me now?
I believe it was just about
Moving the
the villa, and he helped build the youth center. So we have, let me see, involved in the PTA, president of the PTA, involved in the school board, president of the school board, Lions Club president.
Honorary mayor of Orangevale.
Ah, okay.
Probably a dozen times.
Wow.
I mean, I'm sure that the people that do that still, yeah, right. There's a picture that.
You want to hold that up or put it?
If you don't mind, I was going to take both of these out of the frame and.
That's fine. That's
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
I'll go ahead and do that while you're continuing there.
Okay, so
Are you good at putting them back?
I took an excellent picture through the glass.
Yeah, you can take a picture through the glass. But
Yeah, I did that, and for a
Yeah,
picture of a family at the Indian Stone Corral in 1910, and that came out great.
Oh, I remember that the corral.
Well, when we start on your interview, I'd love to hear about that.
Okay.
You guys are lots of
Do
wonderful.
you know what that badge was? It looked like a Century 21 realtor.
Oh yeah, he was a realtor for Century 21 too.
Okay.
he needed something to do after he retired. He sold his refrigeration business, Sacramento Refrigeration. He was, at the time, he was the sole owner. He had a partner that didn't work out too well. But I mean, originally when he went to work for J.N. Blair, he became part owner of that company, which is where he met Milo, who he bought the ranch with. And I guess J.N. Blair, I guess Mr. Blair died or something. I don't know the story on that one. But they renamed the company to Sacramento Refrigeration, and Milo had died by that time too. So, and my dad made one of his journeyman a partner in the company. But yeah, the honorary mayor, and he would, I don't know, he would go around, he was going around to so many business people anyway, even as a realtor. He specialized in well, there was a what do they call them? A lawyer that handles estates, not estates.
Probate?
Probate, yeah. And he was very good friends with the probate lawyer in the same building that his little real estate office was in. And so the probate lawyer would give him houses to sell in probate, and so he did very well on that. And he ended up getting into what is called SREEG, SREEG, which stands for Sacramento Real Estate. The head of the other group was investment group, Sacramento Real Estate Investment Group. And as my dad said, it was full of wolves and snakes and sheep. I mean, there was a lot of wheeler dealer kind of thing in that. I mean, it was during the heyday, like before 2008. Like from 2000 on to like 2008, when the real estate market collapsed. Mm-hmm. But the market kept going up and up and up. And what these people in the Sacramento Real Estate Group would do was they would offer a piece of property for sale that they had bought earlier, that maybe gotten into trade earlier. They would offer it for trade or sale. And they would trade these pieces of property, and they had hundreds and hundreds of pieces of property all over California and Nevada and Oregon and Washington State, all over the West. They had these little pieces of property, 20 acres here, 5 acres there, 15 acres here, 50 acres maybe in up by Paradise, or someplace like that. And but they would trade these little pieces of property back and forth, and they would write the deeds out, and they would trade, give the deeds for this piece of property for these 3 pieces of property, and then both of them would go to the bank with the new property, and they would mortgage it. They would get a second mortgage on it, and they were living off the damn second mortgages, and they kept trading the property so soon. And of course, the thing is, if you traded the property, the second mortgage would get paid off, and they were literally making a living off of these trades that they were doing, and those were the snakes, my dad called them. And then there were the wolves who would come to the group to get rid of a piece of property he couldn't get rid of any other way. My dad probably had 50 pieces of property from that group when he retired. When his will specified 4 of the choicest pieces of property, to one each to my kids. I had 4 children, so anyway. And some of them still have it. My oldest daughter still has I think it's like a 20-acre parcel in the middle of Nevada, but it's on a lake.
No.
So, and the lake has a perfectly straight edge, so it's one of those slip fault lakes in Nevada, where one side slips down and it's a little tilted. So the one side is very irregular, and there's one almost perfectly straight side along the fault.
Any other memories of your parents that you'd like to share?
Well, they were avid gardeners. I think I told you that. I mean, yeah, when growing up in the Depression, I was one of those kids that always was told to finish your dinner. There's starving children in India. Although what my eating my dinner would do for the starving children in India, I never could figure out.
Yeah.
I only asked my mother that question once.
I bet.
So anyway, What else? Yeah.
I'm just amazed by the energy, the involvement in everything, and the physical work, and
It was, they were good friends with a whole lot of people, and I mean, my favorite family were the Vandervoorts. Do you remember the Vandervoorts? Have you heard about the Vandervoorts?
I was talking to one the other day.
Julie? Really?
Mm-hmm.
She was my sweetheart.
Oh.
Well, I didn't know it at the time, but she was Miss Sacramento. I don't
Yes.
think, yeah, she may have told you all about
She's still beautiful.
that. Yeah, she is. Yeah, she is. I didn't know she was still alive.
Yes.
So we kind of lost touch. I mean, we sort of regained touch in when my father's 90th birthday party. Julie's mother was still alive, and my mom and dad were very, very good friends with Dolores and Charles, Julie's father. So
Any other families you remember?
the Pearsons,
Yes, we interviewed them.
Nancy.
Nancy,
Yeah,
we've been over there. To their adobe brick house.
that's true. Yeah.
Okay, and who else?
Oh, the Hodgkins. They had a son named Dick also. My mother was always comparing me to Richard Dick because she noticed peach fuzz on my upper lip, and she said, "You need to shave. Dick is shaving now already." I don't know why that was important either. So. But the worst part about it is once you shave that peach fuzz off, you got to keep shaving it every day, you know, or every other day anyway. So, the Grants, the Rodigers. Have you heard from the Rodigers?
There's a street named that, isn't there?
Yes, there is.
Yes.
There's a Leever Lane too.
Where's that?
It's at the end of Hickory.
Okay.
Off of it used to be the entire road that my dad built was called Leever Lane, but there was another guy that bought a lot from my dad the sewer went in across the creek from them. There was a big sewer line that went in there across the creek from them, and each parcel of land was charged quite a bit of money. It was like, I think my dad's fee, because he had 20 acres on the north side of the creek, and about 2.5 acres on the south side of the creek, which is all he really wanted to keep. And so he subdivided the land, so it was for sale, and they built the sewer across it, and so they assessed him. I think it was like $10,000 per 5-acre parcel, and so he had to sell the land in order to pay for the sewer. You know. So it was one of those things. Although he actually probably could have paid for the sewer at the time because he was doing so well in real estate. The sad thing about my dad was when he was past his 90s, after his 90th birthday, after my mom died actually, and he started losing it. And I remember him telling me, I was sitting with him for a couple hours, and I'd go over every day and make sure he got a hot meal and that kind of stuff. And but he was sitting there, and he was telling me about his best friend when he was a boy, and his name was Dick too, I think. But anyway, and then he's told me all about his real estate, or his refrigeration career. And he could still tell stories about AT&T and about this particular situation and that particular situation, and going over into Nevada and getting his first tattoo, because the tattoo artist was starving to death and kept begging my dad. He actually, for anybody who's going to get a tattoo, I tell them the story. My dad got a bleeding heart, with a banner around it, wrapped around, with waves on the end, and a sword piercing it. Okay, that's what he had on his shoulder when I first saw that tattoo, was a sword, a heart, and a banner. By the time he was 90 years old, it had turned into a stick, a rag, and a prune.
Yeah.
So if you're going to get a tattoo, keep that in mind, or what it's going to look like when you're 90.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, that's lovely. Well, I think we should take a break and
Okay.
then maybe conduct the interview on Bob separately.
Okay.
Okay.
What do you think?
You want me to pause it then?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
Bob,
And we're back.
and Bob, you're going to tell us a story about how your mother arrived in California
Right, yeah.
from Montana.
My grandmother got married when she was 15 to a man who spoke mostly French, and they lived in Montana, and they had immigrated south from one of the Canadian provinces, Ontario, I think, maybe. Anyway, into Montana, one of the provinces, Saskatchewan, maybe, that bordered. And they were the chefs, and they had large families, mostly boys. And my grandfather was, I think, the youngest of like 7 or 8 boys, and he was spoiled rotten. And they were married. They had 4 kids in Montana, and when things started getting rough, he had difficulty getting a job. He ended up being a driver for a tour bus kind of thing, for the rich people that would come to Montana back then, and spend a month on horseback or whatever. And but he just threw up his hands one day and left, leaving my grandmother with four younger children. My mother was probably 10 or 11 at the time. She was the oldest, and my grandmother did the best she could. Her name was Blanche, and she was a Clark, associated with Lewis and Clark. But anyway, my grandmother did the best she could, but times were getting really tough, and she eventually decided that she would have to give the 2 oldest children to my grandfather's mother, who ran a boarding house in not Great Falls, Helena, Montana, the capital, where the mine is. And she took in mainly miners for her boarding house, and her husband lived with her, but he was invalid. So my mother and my uncle Clark lived with their grandmother, would be their grandmother, for maybe 4 or 5 years, and then which was very happy memories for my mother and but except that she was separated from her mother, and her mother found a boyfriend, and but her mother died at the age of 29 from what they called pernicious anemia, which was probably leukemia.
Right.
So anyway, my mother's still living with her grandmother when her mother died, and but her grandfather died, and at that point it became too much for the grandmother. So she contacted other family members, and a family in Indiana, the Clark family, took them in, but they treated the 2 children as servants, not as relatives. And they treated them terribly, to the point where my Uncle Clark, my grandfather, my mother's father, did remain in contact with the children by sending letters to them. I think I still have a few of those. Somebody in my family still has a couple of those letters where my mother was answering her father back. So they knew where my father lived. He lived in Sacramento, or my grandfather lived in Sacramento. And anyway, my Uncle Clark, I think he was probably, he would have been 16. My mother would have been 17, or 15 and 17. My Uncle Clark ran away and hitchhiked, walked from Indiana to California by himself. Just boggles the mind,
Yes, it does.
and managed to survive on the way, and got to Sacramento and moved in with his father and got a job and all, the whole thing. And again, this is right in the middle of the Great Depression. And my mother was so pissed at him. And he said, and when later on, and I was actually privy to this conversation, was, I'm still pissed at you for running away. He said, why? It was the right thing to do. I mean, they were treating us horribly. And my mother says, yeah, but you should have taken me with you. And my Uncle Clark looked at her and said, but you're a girl. But my mother turned 18, which was, that was legal at the time, and she took the bus to Sacramento. So that was how my mother by escaping from this other environment and saving her what little money she had and earned, she managed to get a bus ticket to Sacramento when she was 18. So that's how she ended up in Sacramento, and she reconciled with her father, and they, he was a nice man, but he was just overwhelmed with all of the responsibility, and he didn't have the resilience of like a second or a third or a fourth or a fifth child would have. No, he was the youngest, and he probably stunned a little bit emotionally, kind of thing. Very nice man. Spoke fluent French, even when I knew him, and horrible English. He was I was like 8 years old when I first met him, and maybe a little younger than that. Maybe I don't even remember the first meeting, but I do remember meeting him when I was like 8, because I remember my mom and dad and me going over there to visit them. They lived in Sacramento, on the south side of Sacramento, on a little farm, and it was my grandfather's third wife, actually, that I called Grandma. And I remember going over there one time, and they had chickens and some farm animals, and stuff that they took care of and got eggs from and stuff. And they were white leghorn chickens, and they were giant. I mean, I was a little kid, and they looked really big to me, and I was always quite leery of them because they would, look at you and go, at you, And but anyway, I asked my grandmother where Grandpa was, and she said, "Oh, the chicken that ate him," and then went on with her conversation with my mother. And I was horrified. But it was very difficult for me to understand it. But actually, my mother could still speak French because she had grown up in a French-speaking community. In fact, she took Spanish years later, and she was always kind of shy about speaking out, which is odd for being the president of all the organizations she was. When she was taking Spanish, the instructor asked her to read the paragraph, or no, to recite the paragraph she had just read in Spanish, which gives you a good idea of your memory, and you also being able to substitute words for words you don't remember, kind of thing, Spanish words. So she stood up and she recited the paragraph, and the instructor didn't say anything for quite a while, and he said, "Mrs. Leever, that was excellent French. Can you now do it in Spanish?" So she's still, that was when she was like in her 60s. So, and she hadn't spoken a word of French except to her father for years. And so anyway, that's the story about how my mother got to California.
All right. Well, we will continue our interview about your childhood experiences in Orangevale at another time. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.